You were told prayer is supposed to change things, but look around. Nothing changed. You have spoken words into the silence. You have bent your knees until they hurt. You have closed your eyes and waited like the waiting was the whole point. And when you finally opened them, the universe remained exactly as it was. Here's what they won't tell you, and I'm saying it straight because someone needs to. The prayer you were taught was never meant to work the way you were promised. I'm not saying you did it wrong. I'm saying the system was built this way. It was designed to keep you asking, to keep you begging, to keep you dependent on powers that claim to be above you, just out of reach, always one more plea away. That is not a mistake. That is a leash. But there was another prayer, a different kind of speaking, one that didn't ask, one that commanded, one that didn't grovel for permission, but moved mountains, healed the sick, and raised the dead like reality itself, had to listen. And before you roll your eyes, hear this part. Jesus used it before every miracle, every single one. Not once, not sometimes, every single time. And they stopped teaching it the moment they realized what it could do, because the second you remember how to pray like that, you stop pleading with life, and you start speaking back. The strange thing about the prayer you were raised on is this. It trains you to shrink. If you've felt that quiet resentment in your chest, you're not broken. You're noticing a crack in the glass. There is a way of speaking to life that doesn't make you smaller. It makes you sovereign in a gentle sense, not a tyrant, not someone demanding the universe obey, just someone who finally stands upright inside their own spirit. It doesn't dress you up as a servant begging at a locked gate. It reminds you you were born with a key, and maybe you forgot it on purpose, because forgetting was safer. And when you remember how to speak from that place, something shifts, not like lightning on demand, but like the moment you realize the room you've been trapped in has been unlocked the entire time. If you're listening right now, it's probably because a part of you recognizes the feeling of edited stories. You've heard sacred words in sacred halls, but sometimes they sounded like they had been sanded down, softened, made harmless, not wrong, just domesticated. In the older Gnostic mood, there's this sense of an archive under the archive, a hidden shelf where the dangerous versions of teachings survive, not to start fights, but to wake up the part of you that can no longer pretend it doesn't know. And here's one of those dangerous ideas, offered as an invitation, not a verdict. The Jesus many people inherited is often a portrait painted for obedience, while another portrait, preserved in Gnostic texts, feels like a mirror held too close to the face. The sanitized savior who submits, who collapses into helplessness, who models powerlessness as holiness. That image can quietly teach you that divinity lives far away, and you are stuck down here, fallen, waiting for rescue. But the Gnostic-flavored Jesus doesn't move like that. He doesn't plead. He doesn't bargain. He speaks as if the distance between inner intention and outer world is thinner than you were told. When he touches the leper and disease dissolves, when he stands before the tomb and calls Lazarus forward, you don't have to take that as a physics demonstration to feel the deeper symbolic nerve. He is addressing states that people thought were final: contamination, exile, death in life. He is treating them like masks that can be lifted when the soul stops agreeing with the spell. And the engine under that is not drama, it's knowing, not belief, not hype, not denial. A kind of inner clarity, so complete it feels like union. The texts describe it as a place where there is no separation between the speaker and the monad, no gap between intention and manifestation, no doubt, no distance, no intermediary. Notice how that language hits you. It doesn't ask you to join a religion. It asks you to consider a state of being. And then comes a line attributed to the Gospel of Thomas, a line that has startled people for centuries because it moves the whole center of gravity inward. If you bring forth what is within you, what you bring forth will save you. Not what is outside, not what descends from heaven, what is already inside. You can hear why councils and institutions would feel nervous around that sentence, not because it insults anyone, but because it relocates authority. If the spark is already within you, then salvation isn't a product delivered in fragments. Then you don't need a chain of intermediaries to tell you whether you're allowed to touch your own source. You are already whole in seed form, already an emanation, already connected to whatever name you give, the origin that spun the stars into being. And when you speak from that place, you are no longer performing a request. You are declaring a reality you've remembered. The prayer Jesus used in this framing isn't just a script you recite. It's a posture you inhabit. And the lineage behind it is described as older than the synagogue and older than any single canon, a tradition that treats reality as vibration, as sound, as the Word made flesh. In the beginning was the Logos, stops being a pretty metaphor and becomes an image of pattern, a harmonic that condenses into matter, the way a tone can shape sand into geometry, the way a mood can shape a life, the way a single sentence can rearrange a decade in your mind. This is where the Gnostic word gnosis matters, not belief, not faith as a substitute for experience. Direct knowing. The kind of knowing that doesn't sit around hoping for miracles, but creates the conditions where inner transformation becomes inevitable. And now the story gets precise, not because it wants to trap you in a technique, but because it wants to show you the doorway Jesus allegedly used before his works. Before the outer moment, he pauses. He withdraws. He goes into silence, sometimes into the mountains, sometimes into the wilderness, sometimes simply into himself. And in that silence, something happens that looks small from the outside, but feels enormous from the inside. He doesn't ask God for power. He aligns with the pleroma, the fullness, the realm of wholeness that exists before fear splits the mind into me and not me. Before the fall, before the demiurge is imagined as the false architect of a cramped reality, before the archons are described as rulers of distraction and distortion, he returns to the place where he and the Father are one, not as a slogan, but as an inner condition. And from that union, he speaks. The words themselves are described as simple, so simple scholars miss them, because scholars often look for complexity as proof. The transcript points to Aramaic roots, to a phrase modern translations flatten, like "Our Father who art in heaven," and then gently cracks it open, Abu, as generative force. Breath moving through all things. Dwashaya, not as a distant throne room, but as presence in all dimensions, in light and shadow, in matter and spirit, the seen and unseen. Even if you treat that as poetic rather than literal linguistics, feel what it does emotionally. It relocates God from far away to everywhere, including inside you. And then the center line drops. When Jesus speaks from that place, he isn't calling on something outside himself. He is activating something within, and it leads to the part that makes people uneasy. The part that sounds forbidden, not because it's evil, but because it makes you responsible. The prayer isn't about the words. It's about frequency, resonance. The human voice, when aligned with intention and emptied of ego, becomes a tuning fork. It vibrates at the frequency of what you might call creation, not as a scientific claim you must swallow, but as an inner experience you might recognize the first time you speak a truth you've been avoiding and feel your whole body snap into coherence. This is why mystics across traditions talk about sacred sound. Om. The Sufi breath name. The Kabbalistic letters. The ineffable name of the monad. Not as magic syllables, but as keys, sonic keys that unlock dimensions of perception, that dissolve the false architecture built around your mind, that remind the divine spark within you of its native tone. And if you're wondering where this becomes more than beautiful language, the next layer in the original thread points to a specific Gnostic text people tried to destroy, Pistis, Sophia, and to a scene where Jesus is asked how he performs his works, which is where the story starts to describe the method as an inner harmonizing with aeons, with emanations beyond time, before any word of power is spoken. That's where we're going next. That scene in Pistis Sophia is where the story stops sounding like poetry and starts sounding like a map, not a map of geography, but a map of inner state. Because the disciples don't ask for philosophy, they ask the question people still ask when they're tired of slogans. How do you do it? How do you speak in a way that changes what seemed unchangeable? And Jesus, in this telling, doesn't hand them a spell. He describes alignment. He says he aligns his voice with the voice of the aeons, the living emanations of the monad, powers that exist beyond ordinary time. And even if you hold that language lightly, even if you take aeons as symbols for deeper layers of consciousness, you can feel the point. He is describing a way of becoming coherent inside yourself before you try to move anything outside yourself. Before any word of power, he harmonizes his inner state with the pleroma. He removes fear, he removes doubt, he removes the illusion of separation. And notice how intimate that is. The miracle begins as an inner subtraction, not adding more effort, not performing harder, but releasing the noise that makes your voice shaky. In that state of unity, he becomes a conduit, not for an external force arriving like a rescue helicopter, but for the power that is already the essence of all things. The way a lamp doesn't beg electricity to love it. It simply clears the blockage and the current shows itself. That is why the transcript keeps repeating the same subtle reversal. This prayer is not a script, not a formula, but a state of being, a remembering, a return. A return to the garden, which in this style of storytelling is less about a literal orchard and more about an original condition in you. The part of you that existed before shame made you feel exiled from your own center. Before the fall, before Sophia's descent is framed as a cosmic sorrow, before the demiurge is framed as the false craftsman of a cramped reality, before a veil is imagined between you and your origin, the heart of the teaching is simple enough to offend the part of the mind that likes complexity. When Jesus says, "I and the Father are one," he is not necessarily claiming to be special. He is describing what becomes true for anyone who awakens, that the separation is the lie, and the prayer is the remembering. This is where the tone turns quietly dangerous, because if you let yourself feel that for even 5 seconds, you also feel what collapses with it. The need to beg, the habit of making yourself small, the addiction to an intermediary. And you can see why institutions, especially institutions that survive by managing access to the sacred, would feel threatened by a Jesus who teaches sovereignty as a lived state. The transcript frames it as a problem the Orthodox Church could not tolerate, not because it hated holiness, but because it could not control a holiness that made people ungovernable. A Jesus who says, "You will do greater works than these," is hard to build an empire around, because it puts the future in the hands of ordinary people. A Jesus who reveals the kingdom of heaven is within is hard to monetize, because it means the gate is inside you, not behind a counter. So the story says they did what empires tend to do when they meet a teaching that won't kneel. They edited, they removed the Gnostic Gospels, they burned mystical teachings. They turned a master of consciousness into a sacrificial lamb, not to mock him, but to reshape his meaning into something safer, something that teaches endurance without awakening, submission without union. And then, with the story rewritten, the prayer of alignment is replaced with the prayer of supplication, the kind that keeps you waiting, keeps you begging, keeps you convinced someone else must intercede. You don't have to treat that as a conspiracy you must accept in full for it to still touch a nerve. because you can feel the psychological difference between a prayer that collapses you and a prayer that returns you to your spine. One makes you hope, the other makes you remember. And in the transcript, the suppression isn't framed as a tidy disagreement. It's framed as a war for human consciousness, because the demiurge, the false god of this material realm in the Gnostic imagination, wins by keeping you convinced you are separate, small, and dependent, and his archonic servants, those rulers of distraction and distortion, feed on fear, doubt, and ignorance, which again can be held symbolically as the inner forces that keep you looping, scrolling, reacting, living from the outside in. The moment you wake up to your own divine nature, the game ends, not in some violent revolution, but in a quiet shift where the old levers stop working on you. That is why the transcript uses the language of burial and erasure. The Gnostic texts were hidden. Councils like Nicaea are invoked as moments where whole streams of teaching were set aside. Mystics are remembered as people punished, not necessarily because they were evil, but because they were inconvenient. And yet the story also insists on something tender. Fragments survived, whispered through lineages hidden in symbols, encoded in texts the censors didn't understand, not so you could win an argument at a dinner table, but so that when the time came, the right ears would recognize the tone. That's the mythic intimacy of it. It speaks to the part of you that has felt, at some point, that your life is not just a sequence of events but a kind of call, and maybe the reason you're drawn to this material is not because you want to be right, but because you want to stop living as a half version of yourself. So when the transcript says, "Fragments are surfacing again in this age," treat that not as a headline, but as an inner timing, the feeling that now is a threshold, that you don't get infinite chances to meet the same insight with the same intensity. And right here is where the narrative pivots from lore into practice, because it offers an anatomy, a structure, not as a rigid ritual, but as a sequence of inner movements. It starts with withdrawal from the outer world, not because the world is bad, but because the outer world is loud, and a loud mind cannot hear its own source. Solitude is described as necessity, because distraction is the natural habitat of the archonic pattern. Then comes alignment with the pleroma, because most people try to pray while still fused to the small self, still soaked in fear, lack, and separation. And the transcript's point is that you cannot speak a sovereign word while secretly believing you are not allowed to exist. It's like trying to play a clear note through a cracked instrument. So the invitation is to step into the inner temple, the place the demiurge cannot reach, which is a mythic way of saying there is a part of you that propaganda cannot colonize if you return to it. From there, the rest of the anatomy unfolds, the sacred name, the declaration from knowing, gratitude before the fact, and even a paradox about releasing attachment, but those belong to the next part, because if you rush them, they become another script to beg with, and the whole point of this story is to move you from being stuck to being opened, to being quietly empowered, in that exact order. And that's the trap you can fall into if you move too fast. You hear a sequence like this, and your mind immediately wants to turn it into a hack, a shortcut, a ritual you can perform, the way you repeat a password at a locked door. But in the logic of the transcript, the door was never locked from the outside. The lock was the state you brought to it. So, the anatomy continues, not as a rigid formula, but as a deepening of posture, 5 movements that are really one movement, returning to yourself until your voice stops wobbling. First is withdrawal from the outer world, which we already touched, but here it becomes even more intimate. Withdrawal doesn't mean you hate the world. It means you refuse to let the world define your inner tone for the next 10 minutes. It means you step out of the kingdom of noise, not because noise is evil, but because noise makes you forget what you actually want to say. In the transcript's imagery, the outer world is the domain of archons, rulers of distraction and illusion, And you don't have to picture cosmic beings to understand the psychological truth. Your attention is the throne. Whoever sits on it decides what reality feels like. When you withdraw, you are taking the throne back. You are entering what the story calls the inner temple, the place the demiurge cannot reach, the part of you that cannot be bribed or shamed or frightened into surrender if you stand inside it. Second is alignment with the pleroma, and this is the quiet center of everything. The transcript says, most people fail here because they try to pray while still identified with ego, with the small self, with fear and lack and separation. In other words, they try to speak a sovereign sentence while secretly narrating themselves as powerless. It's like asking the ocean for water while standing in the rain. Alignment is not forcing yourself to feel spiritual. It's remembering in your bones that you are not outside the source looking in. You are an expression of it, a wave in an infinite sea. When you touch that, not as a belief but as a felt recognition, your voice changes, your breath changes, your urgency becomes clean. Your desire stops sounding like desperation and starts sounding like direction. Third is the invocation of the sacred name, which is where the language becomes mythic again. Every tradition has a way of pointing at the unnameable. The transcript mentions the Hebrew mysteries, the Yod-He-Vav, a name treated as too holy to speak casually. But even if you don't attach yourself to the historical details, the symbolic meaning is strong. The sacred name is not a magic syllable. It is a way of collapsing distance inside you. It is the moment you stop addressing God as a faraway monarch and begin relating to the divine as the ground of your own being, the source field that is closer than your next thought. In the transcript's phrasing, Jesus didn't call on a distant God. He vibrated the name that dissolved all distance. He spoke the frequency that collapsed separation. And in that moment, there was no Jesus and God. There was only the one. If you translate that into inner practice, it's the moment you stop praying as a split person and start praying as a whole person. You stop performing spirituality and begin inhabiting it. Fourth is the declaration from knowing, and this is where the story flips the emotional script people carry around prayer. You were trained to ask, to plead, to hope, to bargain. The transcript says, that is the part translations obscure. When he speaks at the edge of what people call final, it isn't framed as a request. It is a command issued from absolute certainty. But the point isn't that you go around commanding life like a tyrant. The point is that your inner language becomes clear. You stop speaking from panic. You stop speaking from lack. You speak from the place in you that already knows what is real beneath the fear. Life and death are illusions, the transcript says. Consciousness is eternal. The body is a garment the spirit wears. You can hear the Gnostic worldview behind those lines, but you can also hold them as metaphors for psychological rebirth. A part of you has been in a tomb. A part of you has been wrapped in old stories, old identities, old shame. And when you speak from knowing, you are not forcing the universe to comply. You are speaking as the universe, which in simpler terms means your words align with the deepest truth you can feel, and reality begins to reorganize around coherence. Not instantly, not like fireworks, but in the way a life reorganizes when someone finally stops lying to themselves. Fifth is gratitude before the fact, and this is the paradox that separates begging from creating. Gratitude after you get what you want is normal. Gratitude before you see anything is a signal. In the transcript's language, the pleroma contains all possibilities simultaneously, healing and sickness, abundance and lack, and the one who gives thanks before seeing the result is choosing which reality collapses into form. It calls this quantum mysticism disguised as prayer, which you don't have to take literally to understand emotionally. Gratitude before the fact is the act of standing in the version of yourself who is already whole, already connected, already supported, and letting that version speak first. It's not denial, it's orientation. It's refusing to let fear be the author of your future. And then, tucked inside this anatomy, the transcript adds a step that sounds like it contradicts the command: release attachment to the outcome. Speak with certainty, then let go. Because the one who clings is still operating from separation, still trying to control reality from a place of insecurity. Letting go is not giving up. Letting go is trusting the word you spoke from coherence will keep moving even when you stop watching it. The Logos does not fail, the transcript says. It cannot. It is the fabric of reality itself. In inner terms, the decision you make from deep clarity keeps working even when your mood changes. The identity you claim in stillness keeps shaping your choices even when the day gets loud. And that is why the story insists this is not magic. It is mastery, not mastery over others. Mastery over the illusion of separation, over the belief that you are small, over the lie that divinity is somewhere else. Then it returns to the question of suppression, because without that, the emotional urgency would fade. It says this wasn't only theological disagreement, it was war, a war for human consciousness. The demiurge, the false god in the Gnostic imagination, survives by keeping you asleep inside fear and control. He works through institutions and dogma, and anyone who claims power belongs elsewhere. That you need a priest to reach God, that you need a church to be saved, that you need to confess to an intermediary. Again, you can hold that as literal myth or as a symbolic description of any system that teaches you not to trust your own inner knowing. The effect is the same. You stay dependent, you stay small. And then comes the sentence that is both a comfort and a challenge. The moment you remember how to pray from that place, you become ungovernable. Not in the sense of rebellion for its own sake, but in the sense that fear-based control stops working on you. The story says, that's why texts were buried, why councils removed books, why mystics were burned as heretics, not because they were wrong, but because their rightness threatened the empire. And then it pivots into a quieter invitation. How do you pray like Jesus? Not by repeating words, not by following rituals, but by doing what he did. Enter silence. Step out of the noise and the identities that trap you in the small self. Go inward to the still point where the divine spark remembers its origin. Recognize unity with the source as direct knowing. Feel it in your breath, in the space between thoughts. Speak from that place, not from need, but from certainty. Release attachment. Give thanks. And then it adds a layer beneath the layer, the prayer as protection. Protection from what? From archons, rulers of this world, beings that feed on fear and doubt and ignorance. Again, whether you see them as cosmic entities or as inner patterns, the message is the same. Fear cannot touch the one who knows. Manipulation cannot hook the one who sees. Control cannot grip the one who speaks from wholeness. That's why, in the story, Jesus walks unharmed through hostile crowds. That's why he stands before Pilate without fear. That's why, even in the darkest hour, he remains sovereign. He's operating from a frequency the archons cannot reach, a dimension where their power does not exist. And when you pray from that place, you step into the same protection, which in everyday life might look like this. The old triggers still exist, but they don't run your nervous system. The world can shout, but you don't immediately obey. Then the Nag Hammadi mood enters, the seal of the living, a spiritual imprint marking those who have awakened, and the archons recoil when they see it, because it reminds them of what they lost, the fullness they were exiled from, the light they can't extinguish. If you translate that into personal experience, it's the way certain kinds of manipulation stop approaching you once you stop being available for them. Your energy changes. Your boundaries become quiet and absolute. You don't have to fight. You simply don't resonate with the trap anymore. The story calls this ultimate gnosis, realizing the world is not your enemy. The demiurge is not all-powerful. The archons are not invincible. They hold power only over those who believe in separation. But the one who remembers becomes a beacon, living proof the prison has no walls and the chains are illusions. And then it widens out into a vision. Imagine millions remembering this. Imagine prayer of alignment becoming default, humanity stopping begging and starting creating, divine sparks igniting. And what would happen to structures built on fear, to institutions profiting from ignorance, to systems requiring submission? The transcript says they would crumble, not through violence, not through revolution, through obsolescence, because a sovereign being has no use for masters, a conscious creator has no use for saviors, an awakened soul has no use for lies. That is why they stopped teaching the prayer. It says, not to destroy knowledge, but to delay awakening, to buy time for archonic systems to entrench themselves. But time is up, seals are breaking, texts are surfacing, and those who remember are gathering. And here is the most intimate move in the whole piece, the line that makes it feel like a message slipped under your door. You are one of them, or you wouldn't be here. You wouldn't have made it this far. You wouldn't feel that resonance in your chest as these words land. Something in you knows, has always known, and now it's time to stop pretending you don't. What you've just moved through isn't meant to leave you tense or pressured, and it isn't meant to turn into another heavy thing you have to do right. If anything, it's been a quiet remembering, a soft return to a place inside you that has never actually been out of reach. The moments that hit you in the chest, the sudden calm, the slight resistance, the strange familiarity, even the questions that surfaced, none of it is random. It makes sense that something in you reacted, because this story has been pointing at a feeling you already know, the sense that power was never meant to live at a distance, the sense that the most sacred door was always closer than you were taught. When the old language of prayer sounded like begging, and the older language sounded like alignment, you probably felt the difference immediately, not as a debate, but as a shift in your body. That shift matters. It's a sign that your inner life is still listening. The silence we kept returning to isn't an escape from the world. It's simply the space where the noise stops borrowing your voice. And the idea of the divine spark, the monad, the pleroma, the logos, doesn't have to be held like a doctrine to be real in you. It can be held like a mirror, something that reflects you back to yourself, whole and unbroken, even if you're still healing, even if you're still learning how to trust your own inner knowing. If any part of you felt relieved by the thought that you are not late, not off course, not forgotten, let that relief be enough for tonight. You don't have to force anything to happen. You don't have to chase fireworks. The way this path works, in the way the old texts whisper it, is often through subtle openings, a door that doesn't slam wide but quietly unlocks, a burden that loosens, a thought that stops ruling you, a gentler courage that shows up without announcement. And if you felt the theme underneath everything, that separation is a kind of spell and remembering is a kind of return, then you already understand the heart of what was shared here, not as a command, as recognition, as a calm certainty that whatever season you're in right now, it fits you, and it's carrying you somewhere real. So, take a breath and let the ideas settle like dust falling after a long storm, and when you're ready, there's another piece of this same thread waiting for you in the next video. Gnosticism has always felt to me less like a religion you join, and more like a lantern someone quietly places in your hands when you've been walking through life with your eyes half adjusted to the dark. Because it doesn't demand that you fight anyone's faith. It simply asks you to notice what happens inside you when a familiar story suddenly turns and shows a hidden door. That's what this message does. It doesn't try to prove anything like a courtroom. It feels more like standing in an old stone corridor, running your fingers along the wall and realizing the solid part was only painted on. It reframes prayer from a plea into a posture, from reaching outward into returning inward. Most people know what it feels like to whisper into silence and secretly wonder if they're doing it wrong. And when you hear a version of prayer that sounds like remembrance, like returning to your own inner center, something in the chest loosens, almost like it recognizes its own name. I don't hear this as a promise of instant miracles. I hear it as an invitation to stop abandoning yourself in the moment you need yourself most, to let your words come from a steadier place, and to trust that subtle shifts are still real shifts. If any part of you felt seen while listening, if you felt that quiet spark of, wait, this is about me, I'd love to know you're here with me in this. Drop a comment with a simple line, I remember. And if this kind of hidden, gentle unveiling speaks to you, tap like so more people who are searching in silence can find it. And subscribe so you don't miss the next thread we pull, because this isn't about winning an argument, it's about finding your way back to yourself, one veil at a time.